The night before my convocation, my mother called me to say she wouldn't be coming. Not because she was sick, not because something terrible had happened. She said, and I remember every word because I've replayed them probably 400 times since, "Your sister has her yoga retreat this weekend and I already paid the deposit. You understand, don't you, sweetheart? You can just walk across the stage by yourself. It's not like you need someone holding your hand." I was 28 years old. I had just completed a 4-year PhD in epidemiology at the University of Toronto. I had spent 3 of those years waking up at 5 in the morning to work a shift at the hospital before my research hours. I had defended my dissertation in front of a committee that included 2 of the most respected names in public health in the country. And my mother was skipping my convocation because my sister had booked a weekend at a spa retreat in Collingwood. I sat on the edge of my bed in my apartment on Spadina, and I just stared at the wall for a long time. My roommate knocked on my door around 9, and I told her I was fine. I wasn't fine, but saying it out loud would have made it real, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Here's what you need to understand about my family. We're not a dramatic family in the way people imagine when they think of dysfunction. There are no screaming matches at Christmas dinner. Nobody throws things. It's quieter than that, and somehow that makes it worse. My mother has always had a way of making me feel like I'm being unreasonable for wanting what I want. Like the very act of needing something from her is an imposition. My sister is 3 years older than me. She's a lifestyle blogger with about 40,000 Instagram followers, and my mother thinks she hung the moon. She's never finished a degree. She's been through 4 different careers, and every time one doesn't work out, my mother refinances something or moves money around and somehow the bills get paid. I don't say this to be cruel. I say it because it is the pattern of my entire life, and understanding the pattern matters for understanding what happened at that convocation. When I was 16 and got into the gifted program at my school, my mother forgot to come to the ceremony because she was helping my sister move apartments. When I got my undergraduate acceptance to U of T, my mother's reaction was to ask whether I'd considered going to a school closer to home so I could look after my grandmother on weekends. When I got the call that I'd been awarded a doctoral fellowship, which covered my tuition and gave me a living stipend, my mother said, "Well, good for you," and then asked if I could transfer $50 to my sister via e-transfer because she was short on groceries. I transferred the money. I always transferred the money. My father left when I was 11, and my mother has never entirely forgiven me for looking like him. I know that sounds like a strange thing to say, but it's true. She's told me, on more than one occasion, usually at the tail end of a glass of wine, that sometimes when she looks at me, she feels like she's looking at a ghost. My sister has her eyes and her laugh and her way of moving through a room, and I have my father's cheekbones and his stubborn silences and apparently his habit of making her feel guilty without meaning to. I stopped expecting things from her a long time ago, or I thought I had. Sitting on that bed the night before convocation, I realized I had never stopped expecting things. I had just gotten better at pretending not to. My aunt called me at 10:30 that night. She's my father's sister, and my mother has always been frosty toward her, but she's been one of the most consistent people in my life since he left. She lives in Mississauga and drives a 15-year-old Civic and volunteers on Tuesday evenings at a community kitchen on Dundas Street. She asked how I was doing, and I said fine, and she said, "Your mother called me earlier to tell me she wasn't going to make it." I didn't say anything. "I want to come," she said. "If you'll have me." I told her, of course. And then I cried for about 45 minutes after I hung up, because something about being wanted is more destabilizing than being rejected, especially when you've spent so long recalibrating around the rejection. The morning of convocation was unseasonably warm for October. I took the subway to Convocation Hall in my gown and my flat shoes because I've never been able to walk in heels, and I decided that was the one thing I was not going to compromise on that day. My cohort was gathering outside, and there was this buzzing collective energy that I tried to absorb, tried to let it be contagious. My supervisor found me near the doors. Dr. O.C. Mensah, who appears in my acknowledgments, and who I will never be able to fully thank in any format available to human language, put both her hands on my shoulders and looked at me directly and said, "Are you okay?" She is the kind of person who asks that question and actually waits for the answer. I told her my mother wasn't coming. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say that was awful or terrible or what a shame. She just nodded, slowly, and said, "Then I'll be in the front row." I want to tell you that I handled that gracefully. I did not. I had to turn toward the stone wall of the building for about 30 seconds and do some very aggressive blinking before I could look at anyone again. The ceremony started at 2 o'clock. There were maybe 800 people in that hall. Families in good dresses and blazers, people clutching programs, the particular smell of a space that is trying very hard to feel historic and mostly succeeding. My aunt was out there somewhere. Dr. Osi Mensah was out there somewhere. We were called in alphabetical order by last name, and mine put me near the end of the first half, which meant I spent 40 minutes watching other people cross that stage and shake hands with the dean while their families erupted in the particular unself-conscious way that families do when they are proud and happy and can't contain it. I thought about my mother exactly once during those 40 minutes. I thought, she is probably in some overpriced infrared sauna in Collingwood right now, and my sister is probably telling her about some new supplement she's taking, and neither of them is thinking about me at all. I was surprised to find that the thought didn't hurt as much as I expected it to. It mostly just felt true. When they called my name, I stood up. I walked to the edge of the stage. And then I heard it. From the left side of the hall, maybe 8 rows back, a sound that started with my aunt's voice and then expanded, somehow, into more than one person. Clapping that was too enthusiastic for the occasion, the kind that turns heads. I looked out into the audience and my aunt was standing, and next to her, also standing, was Dr. Osi Mensah, and next to her was a woman I did not recognize. She was maybe 60, white hair pulled back, wearing a blazer the color of a dark forest. She was clapping with the kind of focus you give to something you mean. She caught my eye and she nodded, once, like she'd been waiting. I almost stopped walking. I didn't. I crossed the stage, I shook the dean's hand, I accepted the degree that had cost me 6 years and 3 hospital jobs and more than one relationship and a significant portion of my mental health, and I walked back to my seat with my heart doing something strange and fast in my chest. After the ceremony, I found my aunt outside near the fountain. She was teary and bright-faced, and she hugged me for a long time without saying anything, which is exactly what I needed. And then the woman in the forest green blazer was standing beside her. "This is Lorraine," my aunt said. She was 2 rows ahead of me. When she heard me cheering, she turned around and asked who I was there for, and I told her about you, and she said she wasn't going to let you have an empty row. So she moved. Lorraine looked at me and said, "Epidemiology, infectious disease modeling, your aunt tells me?" I said yes. She said my daughter died of sepsis in 2019. She was 31. The nurses on her floor were run off their feet. I've thought a lot about the systems problem since then. She paused. I'm glad there are people doing the work. I did not know what to say to that. I said thank you, and I meant it in the largest possible way, and I think she understood. We went for dinner at a Korean barbecue place on Bloor that my aunt had been talking about for months. The 3 of us sat around the grill, and the conversation moved between the easy and the serious in the way it does when the people are right. Lorraine had been a public health nurse for 30 years before she retired. She had opinions about the federal healthcare transfer, and she was not shy about sharing them. My aunt kept putting more meat on my plate without asking. At some point around the second round of soju, Lorraine looked at me and said, "Does your mother know what she missed today?" I said I wasn't sure she'd think she missed anything. Lorraine considered this for a long moment. Then she said, "The thing about people who don't show up is that eventually the absence becomes the story. She'll tell the story of your life for the rest of her life, and the inconvenient truth is that she won't be in any of the good chapters." I turned that sentence over in my head for a long time after dinner. My mother called me the following Tuesday. Not Sunday, not Monday. Tuesday. She said the retreat had been exactly what she needed, and that she'd been dealing with a lot of stress lately and she hoped I understood. Then she asked how Convocation had gone. I said it had been wonderful. She said, "Good, I knew you didn't really need us there." I almost let it go. I have let things go 1,000 times in my life, let them slide past because fighting was exhausting and the outcome was always the same. But something had shifted in me since Sunday, and I found myself saying quietly, "I did need you there. I needed you there and you chose not to come." Silence. Then. "I don't think that's fair, sweetheart. You know how complicated things are." "I know," I said, "but I wanted you to know that I noticed, and it hurt." She didn't apologize. She redirected to something my sister was dealing with, some issue with a brand partnership falling through, and I listened for a few minutes and then told her I had to go. What I didn't tell her was what had happened 3 days after Convocation. I had sent Dr. Osi Mensah a thank you note, a real one, written on paper, because she's that kind of person and she deserves that kind of gesture. In the note, I mentioned that I was in the early stages of applying for a federal public health research grant, a major one, the kind that could fund a full lab for 5 years. It was a long shot, I told her that. She called me the next morning and said she'd been meaning to talk to me about something. Sue. The university was establishing a new research chair in community epidemiology, an endowed position, and the selection committee had asked her for nominations. She had nominated me. I sat in my kitchen and I didn't say anything for a few seconds, and she said, "You'll have to apply formally, of course. I can't guarantee anything, but I want you to know you have my full support." The committee met in November. I found out in January. My mother called in February to tell me my sister was going on a media tour for a new wellness product she'd partnered with, and wasn't that exciting, and did I know anyone in media who might be interested in covering it? I told her, as calmly as I could, that I had been appointed to the research chair in community epidemiology at the university, that I would be leading a team, that my work would be focused on health equity in Northern Ontario communities, some of the most underserved in the country. Silence again, a different kind. "Oh," she said. "Well, that's wonderful." There was something in her voice that I had never heard before. I've spent a lot of time since then trying to name it. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was something more complicated than that. Something closer to the realization that a story she had been telling herself about who I was and what I was capable of and how much I needed her was not the story that was actually true. "The chair is named after an endowment," I told her. "The donor wanted it named in honor of someone. They chose Dr. Osai Mensah's mentor, a woman who spent 40 years doing community health work in this country." My mother said, "Oh, I thought maybe they would name it after you." "I'm 30 years old," I said. "There's time." She didn't know what to do with that. She pivoted to asking whether I would be getting a raise, and I told her yes, significantly, and then she asked if I could help my sister with a business loan she was trying to secure, and whether I might co-sign. I said no. For the first time in my life, I said no, and I did not offer an explanation or an apology or an alternative. I just said no. She told me I had always been selfish, that I had always put my ambitions ahead of my family, that my father had been the same way, and she supposed she shouldn't be surprised. I said, "You missed my convocation to take my sister to a spa. I am the one who showed up. I have always been the one who showed up, and I am done pretending otherwise." She hung up. My sister texted me an hour later to say I had made our mother cry and I should be ashamed of myself. I read the message and I put my phone face down on the counter and I made a cup of tea and I stood at my kitchen window and looked out at the street for a long time. There's a particular view from my apartment window that I've been looking at for 6 years now. A bakery across the street that's been there since the 70s, a maple tree that goes spectacular in October, a bus stop where the same man in a yellow raincoat seems to be waiting every single morning regardless of what time I wake up. I have done a lot of thinking at that window. What I thought standing there with my tea was this. I had spent most of my life trying to earn something from my mother that she did not have the capacity to give. Not because she was cruel, exactly, but because she had a fixed idea of who mattered in our family and I was not it, and no amount of achievement was going to change that fixed idea. The PhD hadn't changed it. The chair hadn't changed it. Me finally saying something true out loud certainly hadn't changed it. And the thing was, and this is the part I didn't expect, I was okay. Not happy exactly, not unaffected, but okay in the way that you are okay when you finally stop waiting for a train that was never coming and you start figuring out how to walk where you're going instead. I called Lorraine that evening. I had gotten her number at the dinner in October, and I had texted her once after, thanking her again, and she had replied with a short message that ended with "Don't be a stranger." I told her what had happened. All of it. The conversation with my mother, my sister's text, the whole thing. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I finished, she said, "You know what I think? I think you did something incredibly hard today. I think a lot of people spend their whole lives not doing that thing." I asked her how she dealt with it when the people you love don't see you clearly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You build the family you need, not instead of the one you have. Alongside it, you find the people who can see you and you hold on to them, and you do the work, and eventually the life you're building becomes bigger than the wound." I don't know that I believe that completely yet. But I'm trying. Dr. Osai Mensah and I have coffee every other week. My aunt drives in from Mississauga at least once a month, and we cook together, usually something my grandmother used to make, and sometimes I stay late and we watch old movies on her small television and she falls asleep before the ending and I don't wake her. Lorraine and I text sometimes, mostly links to articles about health policy or dry observations about the news, and every few months we have dinner, the three of us, at that same Korean place on Bloor. My mother and I talk occasionally, not often. I keep the conversations short, and I've stopped volunteering information about my work because her responses are either dismissive or transactional, and I have learned, slowly, to stop feeding something that doesn't grow. My sister launched her wellness product. It did moderately well for about 6 weeks, and then the brand dropped her. My mother did not ask me to help with the aftermath. I noticed this too. What I keep coming back to is the image of Lorraine in that green blazer, standing in Convocation Hall in a seat she moved to, because she heard someone cheering and decided she wanted to be part of it. She didn't know me. She had no reason to stand. She just saw a space that needed filling, and she filled it, and in doing so, she became part of one of the most important days of my life, and my mother, who could have been there, who was invited, who knew what it meant, was not. I don't say that to be bitter. I say it because I think it matters to name the things that are true, even when they're uncomfortable. Especially then. The research chair officially begins in September. I've been quietly building my team, reaching out to people whose work I've admired from a distance, thinking about what it means to have real resources behind the questions I've been asking for years. There's a communities initiative I want to launch in the first year, something that gets us into the field instead of sitting in the lab, and Dr. Osi Mensah has been helping me shape the proposal. My name will not be on the chair. That's not how it works, and I don't need it to be. What I have is the work, and the people, and the morning light coming through my kitchen window, and a cup of tea and a maple tree that will go spectacular again in October. I told Lorraine recently that I thought I had finally, at 30, figured out what I wanted my life to look like. She said, "Good, hold on to that. The people who try to make you feel small are only dangerous if you let them define the dimensions of the room." My aunt, overhearing this from across the table, pointed at Lorraine and said, "Write that down," so I did.